Hey everyone, Roy Rogers from the White Book and the Second Sons here, back with another how and the why of it video. Today we're going to be looking at sort of one of our level up videos. Rather than looking at a specific deck tech or a specific archetype that is dominating the metagame right now or is important in the metagame, we're going to look at a broader level. We're going to look at archetypes in general at Thrones. I think this is a really important heuristic for beginning and intermediate players. I know that one of the ways I became better at the game, a big level up moment for me, was when I began looking at the game through this lens, using this heuristic to shortcut a lot of the thinking at the beginning of a game, and also make it easier for me to sort of parse deck lists, to have more constructive conversations with my friends and my teammates about the game, and just in general sort of begin thinking about the game in a deeper level. Because as a heuristic, it saves you time. It saves when you sit down with your opponent, they flip Martell Wolf. You know this is a control deck, and we'll get to what control decks are in a minute. Well, not a minute, knowing me, but in a little bit. And you'll have a strategy prepared, right? And of course, one of the things when archetypes comes up in our community, people tend to think this is written in stone. They view it as an end rather than a beginning. But the way I want viewers of this video to view it is this is the beginning. This is something that is designed to get you thinking in useful ways and shortcutting some of the hard work of looking at decks, analyzing decks, putting them in places that you can begin developing strategies when you play against them. Because, of course, while these archetypes are great going into a game, in the specific way in which a game plays out in a strategic and tactical level, that's going to break down pretty quick, right? You'll have control decks that are suddenly rushing an opponent down because they had a poor list, or mid-range decks that are playing a control game because of just the way the cards that they drew, or a combo deck that's suddenly, trying to get its opponent to zero because the opponent's draws were really poor, or they mistimed their valor or something, right? There's like archetypes can switch within the tactical nature of a game, but that doesn't mean that the broader picture, the bigger picture stuff, isn't useful in a way of analyzing metagames, analyzing decks, and beginning to think about decks, particularly in those critical turns when you're starting to be like, oh, needs to be my game plan. Because one of the ways in which, again, I got better was to begin thinking about decks and archetypes about the game plan they have. But generally speaking, over a huge mass of games, how is this deck going to play? What's its strategies? What does it need to do? And how do you disrupt it? And that, of course, made me a better player. But again, I just want to do it because every time, because we did a White Book episode about this about 6 months to a year ago, and one of the pieces of feedback that I got, or we got, was this is too hard and fast. I once played a game and this didn't. Control decks played this way, or blah 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 blah. But then that kind of kibitzing isn't what when you talk about archetypes, what they're for. They're a beginning point rather than an end point. It's the same way in which meta tier lists. They're beginning points of analysis. They're sorting mechanisms that allow you to begin to think more deeply about how decks work and how the game should be played on a strategic and tactical level. But they often break down on the ground. But you still need those big picture concepts to begin thinking analytically about how to play the game. So that's what we're going to do here. So the way I'm going to go is I've got 5 archetypes that I've identified in Thrones, and a few sub-archetypes within them that we're going to talk about. We're going to go over them. We're going to go over what their basic strategies are and what they are, and how they work and how they play against each other. We're going to start, if you look at my list here, with sort of like off the tin, as Buzz would say, or good old-fashioned Thrones, the way Sam Bratz would put it, which is mid-range / tempo. And then each one of these, aggro, rush, control, and then combo, is in gameplay levels like a step further and further away from the on-the-tin way to play Thrones. And in many ways, they kind of like circle back around to one another. Like mid-range loses to aggro, which loses to rush, which loses to control, but which loses to combo. Things like that. It's not quite that way, as we'll get into it, but generally speaking, they pair up poorly against each other. Anyway, So let's jump right into what a mid-range deck is. So again, as I said before, this is good old-fashioned Thrones because it's based around the challenges phase. You want to play the best beat sticks that you can across the cost spectrum, but oftentimes mid-range decks are the ones that play the big 7-cost characters, the marquee characters, because they're the best in challenges, right? That makes sense. They cost 7. They often have high strength. They often have cool abilities that play off of challenges, and they're designed to win challenges and get to 15. They're not trying to get you to 0. They're not necessarily trying to rush you down. They're sort of just trying to do the challenge math correctly to win 3 to 6 challenges, usually probably 3 of their own challenges and 1 or 2 of what their opponent is doing a turn, so that they maintain their tempo. Which is why they're sort of mid-range / tempo. Now, of course, tempo, and I plan on doing a video in the future, sort of like one of these level up videos, talks about tempo in Thrones. But tempo is a combination of your board presence, so the characters that you have in play, combined with your card advantage of the cards that you have in your hand, and sort of the amount of gold that you put in to the board over what your opponent has, right? So a tempo, and the ways in which you can exchange card advantage with your opponent in a way that's favorable to you. So if you can put to the sword a 7-cost character, that's a big tempo advantage because you spent 2 gold to eliminate their 7-cost character, right? And things like that. And sort of tempo is that combination of card advantage and board presence that is sort of leads to a successful game. And the fundamental goal about mid-range decks is to maintain tempo, to maintain superior tempo to every other archetype, right? There are other archetypes that will get there, like combo and control decks that can sacrifice tempo. In the case of control, can sacrifice short-term tempo for a long-term tempo advantage, or combo, which doesn't give 2 shits and a fuck about tempo and cares about whether it hits that magic number of 15. So, but mid-range cares the most of all these decks about tempo. It wants to stay ahead of its opponent, and it wants to make moves to destroy its opponent's tempo. And of course, the way in which you can defeat a mid-range deck is to destroy their tempo or set them back. So like bounce effects tend to be pretty good. So Pinch of Powder is a really key both mid-range card. That's why you see it in so many Greyjoy decks, and we'll get to Greyjoy in a minute. And why it's also a good answer to Greyjoy, because it allows you to, for 1 gold, or in the case of if you have Raider in play, 0 gold, to return a character hand, and then your opponent has to play them back out. Or the new Bear event, Banished from the Light, I believe it's called, that for 2 gold and a power challenge win can return an expensive character to or place an expensive character in shadows, which is a huge tempo loss. So again, mid-range decks, all about playing threats across the curve, particularly the top-end threats that are the best at challenges, so the 7 and 6-cost characters, and using them to maintain tempo and to win challenges and get them, and get to 15. So mid-range decks, because of this, they don't tend to be particularly fast. They don't tend to be particularly slow. They probably win about turn 4 on average. Of course, sometimes they can have nut straws where they draw their renowned big dudes and they're just going off, and they win fast. You're like, this is a rush deck that I'm playing against. Not really, but it happens sometimes. And then sometimes they draw poorly and they extend the game, and it goes 7, 8, 9 plots. But most of the time it's plot 4 that they win, that they're able to sort of leverage their superior tempo to push through those challenges and then close the game with some renown or some kind of power claim effect. The most common mid-range deck in the game right now is Greyjoy, whether it's Greyjoy Fealty or Greyjoy, Greyjoy Wars. And this is oftentimes when you see me on Second Sons or the White Book talk about Greyjoy mid-range. That's what I'm talking about. And what they do, these decks, I mean, almost every Thrones player has played against them at some point or another, is they play the big cost 7 and 6 cost characters. Euron, Asha, Balon, Dagmir in some cases, Victarion, either the 6 or 7 cost version. and maintain and use them to push through challenges. They're running some challenge-based tricks, and that's usually where you see most of the tricks in mid-range decks. They're challenge-based ones. In Greyjoy, it's the form of We Do Not Sow, to sort of push their tempo further. And it also maintains its tempo through saves in the form of Risen from the Sea, in the form of Iron Mines, in the form of course, dupes. So dupes are really important in across the board in mid-range. Tyrell mid-range, Lannister mid-range, but also Greyjoy mid-range, right? Because again, it's about the amount of tempo you get out of a single dupe is why my White Book co-host, Scott Levine, hates them so much, and then why control players hate them so much too, is because it allows you to maintain tempo, and particularly when it's on a 7 or 6 class character, that's a huge amount of tempo you're maintaining. Greyjoy, again, Greyjoy Fealty, Greyjoy Wars is not a fast deck. In many ways, that's how you can target it. If you can like force it into a longer game, if your deck has a long-term game plan, you can run it out of ways to maintain its tempo over time. But it's very powerful because of its ability to just seize the board with its saves and with its huge characters that have impact. So like, and the other key thing that really I think makes these Greyjoy mid-range decks the platonic ideal of mid-range is that they can't really win without challenges. So decks that stop them from doing challenges like builders has a really good matchup or a very solid matchup against them. So why play mid-range? Mid-range is the most common form of the way to play the game. It's on the tin. It rewards players who are really good at challenge math, are really good at seeing the plays that are going to maximize their tempo, which not all players, myself included, are necessarily the best at. So why play it? Well, the advantage you get is that you generally speaking, mid-range decks don't often have truly awful matchups. They, at worst, have a 45% matchup at decks, but a lot of them sit at 50-50. And at these 50-50 matchups against across the field, against a variety of archetypes, against Rush, against Aggro, against Control, against Combo, because you have the beef, because you have the challenges, because you're just playing the game on the default speed, you generally don't have a super polarized matchups. Now, occasionally there will be someone will design a control deck or a combo deck that can sort of prey on the nature of mid-range decks, but most of the time it's difficult to do that because they just have so many threats across the board. Their 4-cost characters are the best, their 5-cost characters are the best, their 6-cost characters are the best, their 7-cost characters are the best. Because they don't have a specific game plan that they're trying to execute besides winning challenges, it's difficult necessarily to just be like, oh, I'm going to disrupt that linear strategy that they have and win the game. So, and particularly with the addition of pinch and powder, that creates, again, a further sort of points of sort of smoothing out bad matchups and maintaining your tempo. The advantage also, of course, is at a 50-50 matchup, player skill comes up a huge amount. Of course, variance also gets you, right? At a 50-50 matchup, if you just draw, we're playing a card game, and we're playing a best-of-1 card game, so there's a high variance there. So the variance can also get you, but it can also reward. If it's 50-50, if the better player will usually win because the better player will see the lines that are going to get them out of this relatively even on a matchup level, even game plan. Of course, the disadvantage of playing mid-range is you don't really usually get higher than 55% against decks. You don't have that sort of like polarized matchups that you have with other decks. Like Combo and Control can polarize this matchup because they like 80% of the time I am going to my Drowned God deck is going to beat this Martell Control deck and things like that. But you can't really get that with mid-range. Like Greyjoy Fealty, Greyjoy Wars doesn't have any auto-win or close to auto-win matchups. It has a lot of just solid 50%, 55% win rate matchups that, as a good player across a tournament, that's good for you, but you don't get to steal any free wins with a mid-range deck. You've definitely got to be able to play it out and play those challenges, win those challenges, and get those challenge-based tricks off in the form of pinch or We Do Not Sow or things like that. So mid-range tempo is in many ways the default way of playing the game. So that's our first archetype, and Greyjoy Fealty Greyjoy Wars epitomizes it in the current meta. The second one, which is sort of closest to mid-range in its playstyle, its goal in overall, but it has a much more linear strategy in the mid-range, is of course aggro. Aggro is, as Steve Simoni said at the beginning of 2.0, about getting your opponent to 0. Its character base in some ways will match your mid-range deck, because it's still oftentimes still to this day the best effects to remove your opponent's characters from the board remain challenge based. Varys is maybe the best non-challenge, but it's outside of plots, of course, is probably the best one, but it doesn't really synergize with aggro because it also destroys your board. These one-sided removal effects are challenge-based, generally speaking, outside of plots. And again, even the plots, it kills everything. Valar Dohaeris affects both players. Valar Morghulis kills all opponents. March gets both characters. So you need challenges to get a Put to the Sword, a Banished from the Light, a Pinch of Powder, a Tears of Lys. A Dracarys requires characters to be in play, or not in play, excuse me, in a challenge. Same with Consuming Flames. Aggro is about using those effects, but also things like Claim Raise, and aggro is the archetype you most commonly see 2 claim plots in, because again, that just puts pressure on your opponent. Your goal as an aggro player is not just to maintain a tempo advantage, but to get your opponent's tempo as close to 0 as possible, and maybe not even in the cards in hand, but in board presence, because many decks, particularly like mid-range decks, if you make a big, solid economic investment early, if you can just smash that early investment, a lot of decks can't recover from that. Aggro overall generally tries to win early. It tries to win, and not necessarily win in the sense of get to 15 early, but lock a game as early as turn 1. Again, it's getting your opponent to 0, pushing these 2 claim effects, pushing kill like Miri Mazdur through, pushing just all these Put to the Swords, this sort of targeted kill spells, to use the popular phrase, through. And so right now, the most common aggro deck, of course, is Free Folk. Free Folk is in many ways a mid-range deck. It's running expensive wildlings, but it's designed to win on turn 1. It's designed to use the agendas effect, which of course allows you to get 2 different types of claim in a single challenge. So on the first turn, you can win an intrigue challenge and a 2-claim intrigue challenge, and get your opponent to also do a 2-claim military challenge, and then you can do a regular military challenge, and just sort of snowball it. Much more than mid-range decks, because mid-range decks are sort of about a constant board presence. It's like very smooth. It's like, I've maintained my advantage. I'm going to just make plays that constantly keep us at that level. I don't want to push too hard. I don't want to pull back too. I just wanted the steady kind of pressure that's going to push me to 15 power over time. Aggro is like, no, crank it. I'm going to punch you as hard as I can, and hopefully it will knock you out. Boom, punch in the face. And that's definitely what Free Folk does. But you also see this in the forms of like Dothraki decks, some Targ decks that are out there that are big on like Khal Drogo, because of course Khal Drogo lets you do 2 military challenges and you can push through. But the platonic ideal of an aggro deck as it exists right now is Free Folk. It's very common. Its goal is to punch you out on the first turn, maybe by the second turn, and just your tempo is smashed. And the aggro decks, often what's really funny about them is they don't win fast in that sense. Like, it can take them 4, 5, 6 plots to get to 15 because they don't have renown, but they've locked a game up as early as turn 1. So that's Free Folk. Mid-range and aggro. So this is where you get a 50-50. So mid-range decks, they have a lot of really good answers to aggro because they also have good characters. They're designed to win and lose challenges. Back and forth, do that back and forth. But the problem, of course, is a lot of mid-range decks today rely on 7-cost characters. So if you have an awkward start, a start that doesn't necessarily go wide early, aggro can have an advantage and push you through. You see this with free folk, right? On the other hand, because mid-range decks are primarily about maintaining tempo, they have a lot of tools. So if they can do a bit of a wide start and then just start spamming their good characters and never allow themselves to lose an economic advantage, they'll beat an aggro deck because they have the ability to go toe-to-toe in challenges with aggro. And so aggro is going to need to see all its tricks, but of course mid-range decks have tricks to win challenges. So it's very much balanced in that way. So it's not sort of an easy blow up. Aggro decks also have a tendency to lose to control decks, which we'll get to specifically what control are in a minute. And sometimes lose to combo because, well, particularly passive power combo, because again, passive power and combo decks don't care about tempo, and we'll get more specifically about that. So aggro tends to be pretty well positioned actually in a rush meta, which we'll get to, which is our next archetype we're going to turn to, because aggro can answer rush because rush tends to go all in on a different extreme. If aggro is all about getting your opponent to 0, rush is all about getting itself to 15 as fast as possible. Rush is, of course, the archetype that we have since the end of combo winter. We've sort of steadily seen the most of. It won U.S. Nationals. It with Stark Crossing won U.S. Nationals. Stark Crossing was in the finals of Gen Con. It's done well in Europe. It maintained its, Targ Crossing won Worlds last year. These sort of crossing rush-based strategies have been really strong throughout the 2017-2018 competitive year. And so the goal of rush is, of course, to get to 15 as fast as possible. Some rush decks can win if for some reason they're unopposed as early as turn 1. They center around Lord of the Crossing, which of course gives them an additional power should they win all 3 challenge or win the 3rd challenge. That gives them ability to win that 3rd challenge with that +2 strength. It just sort of it creates a steady clock. Rush is a big predator in the meta overall. It tends to beat the decks below it on my chart here, so it tends to be control and it tends to be combo, and then it tends to lose to the decks above it here, which is kind of why I placed it at 3. It tends to lose to aggro and it tends to lose to midrange, which we'll get to in a minute. But again, rush is all about a single keyword in the game, which is renown. In many ways, midrange, the most midrange keyword is either intimidate or insight. Aggro's is, I don't know, stealth. Stealth is probably the most aggro keyword, but for rush, it's renown. You pick the most renown bodies that your faction has, you put them in play, you maybe use some claim raise effects in the form of like Winter's Coming, or the ability to do multiple challenges in the form of like Khal-Drogo. But generally speaking, and Khal-Drogo has the advantage of also having renown. Maybe you want some stand effects in the form of Winterfell Heart Tree, whatever the Stark stand card is, stand economy card is, and Plaza of Pride to sort of get multiple uses out of characters. Queen's Guard. These kind of effects to sort of, again, get yourself to 15 ASAP, as preferably as early as turn 2, but sometimes sooner, sometimes turn 1. I've won turn 1 as rush decks earlier in the game, earlier in 2nd edition than present, and I've lost turn 1, or at the very least my opponent has gotten to 14 or 13 at the end of the first challenges phase, and then flips heads on spikes to get that 15th power. That is generally it. So tools that allow you to rapidly gain power, such as heads on spikes, superior claim, and renown, effects that give pseudo renown are really good, like the handmaiden that you discard a card, a lord or lady gets a power. These kind of, or honey wine, these kind of effects are what fuel it, right? And of course, rush should be common again to most players today. Probably the most archetypical of this archetype is Stark Crossing. Stark Crossing uses Winter's Coming, some expense. It uses I am no one to push through challenges. It uses superior claim to get fast power. Some versions are running heads on spikes, some are not. But Stark has a ton of renown bodies. It has stand in the form of its new non-limited econ location. It's a lot, and Rob and Wyman, and these are just sort of effects. And Daisy, who's just got a huge amount of strength, and also the renown keyword. So if you can just throw her at a military challenge, throw her at a power challenge, you're in really good spots. It is very, very strong in that sense. So Rush and tends to be really strong against slower decks. And it tends to struggle against board presence based decks. So of course, this is the best example is of course Aggro. Aggro tends to beat up on Rush because Rush tends to have to tap out to do what it needs to do, particularly if it's forced to go first. It's gonna, if it wants, Aggro can shut off its clock. You're in a lot of trouble. And then of course kill spells tend to really, really smash it, right? So okay, my Rob has 6 power on him, but you put him to the sword, or you tearsed him, and then you valored, or you tearsed him, and then put somebody else, and it's just kill spells. Like Dracaris tends to be really strong against crossing decks because they have to do challenges. Mid-range decks also have a tendency to be strong against rush decks because they have to do challenges too, but they don't have a self-imposed clock. So they have the beef to put up. Rob Stark stacks up poorly against Victarion, or evenly with Victarion, and you are able to go toe-to-toe with them in the challenges phase, but they don't have a long game, right? Rush, you give up the ability to play a longer game successfully in exchange for the ability to win a game fast. So, Stark Crossing versus Greyjoy Fealty, Stark Crossing can run over them, but oftentimes just gets stuck in this trap where it can't push through challenges because its opponent is sitting there with an Asha. So its Sansa tricks just don't work because she's got stealth and she's got more strength than Sansa has, and that kind of thing. The same is, of course, true with the other major archetypal deck for Rush, which is Landing Crossing, which kind of brings all the stuff together. It uses challenge-based tricks in the form of Superior Claim, but also Tyrion's Chain. It uses Heads on Spikes to gain power. It uses Cersei to gain power. And of course, it has Renown bodies, right? And Cersei can just stack up power very quickly. But it doesn't have a long game plan. And that's the thing about Rush. So so we've talked about mid-range, we talked about aggro. Neither of those tend to have as much as polarized matchups. Aggros tends to be the most polarized against control decks because they're just designed to prevent challenges from going off. And if you can stop an aggro deck from getting its 2 claim challenges off, it's not really going to be able to do much. And of course, mid-range, we said 50-50, not very polarized against most decks. Rush, on the other hand, tends to be highly polarized. So it can have a 80% win rate against passive power combo decks, which definitely you can Drowned God versus Lanny Crossing is just GG, well played, Lanny Crossing, or for the Drowned God. The Lane just runs over it. Same with Stark, right? It just tends to run over, has a 60, 70. I would actually really say it's an 80% win rate against Drowned God. And even in the days of the winter combo deck, right? Lanny Crossing had a good matchup against the combo deck. It could go faster than an OTK combo deck because it's just combo decks are just letting all these challenges go through. But of course, against really challenge-based decks like aggro decks, Rush drops down to 40% win rate, 30% win rate, and it tends to be very polarized in that sense. So you can have this awesome Rush deck that then just runs into a Free Folk deck, and it just can't survive 3 2-claim challenges at it, a 2-claim Intrigue and 2 2-claim militaries. That's just too much for what it needs to do to win games. Now, so those, the top of my list, 1, 2, and 3, these are challenge-based decks. They tend to, again, focus on the challenge phase. They're very close to on the tin. With sort of Rush being the least, even though Rush still requires challenges. That's what separates it from Combo. Both are designed to go fast, but are focused on. But Combo isn't focused on the challenges phase, while Rush is. Control. This is now we're moving a little bit further away. So Control is all about sacrificing short-term tempo for long-term tempo. It's about running your opponent out of threats and or preventing their threats from just meaning anything. And then over a long game, your tempo is going to stall out, and the control deck is going to gradually grind you into dust until you're crying and you don't want to play anymore because of these orange cards. Oh my god, they're the worst. They tend to focus much less on board presence and more on card advantage. And they tend to, again, sacrifice short-term tempo. So they might play like 2 characters on the first turn, but draw a bunch of cards so that they can leverage that card advantage for long-term tempo. They tend to like removal effects, of course, and they tend to like non-challenge based removal effects. So that means plots, that means Varys, that means Ramsey, that means return to hand characters, or events and characters that return things to hand, things that pop people out of challenges to sort of screw with your opponent's ability. So of course, Corset or Hota is very strong. They tend to like ambush effects, icon control. So generally speaking, control tends to be, and of course there's soft control effects in the form of Kneel. But control decks in the current meta tend to orient around sort of three houses, which is of course Martell, Night's Watch, and to a lesser extent Baratheon. This is not a video to be talking about the strengths and weaknesses of Baratheon, but Baratheon's soft control is a control deck. You can look at the deck that Jesse Carpenter and Nick Hansen were playing earlier in the year, the Bara Faith Militant. And I think the Bara Wolf that was at Worlds is also a control deck and did well at Worlds. It uses the soft control alongside Stark cards. Now, the most interesting thing about Stark cards is that they're great control cards. Ward, of course, stealing your opponent's character, destroying their tempo, and improving yours, is huge. Ramsey is really powerful. Frozen Solid is really good to shut so your opponent paid 3 gold for this awesome location. You paid 1 gold. Major tempo hit for them, right? These tend to be really good control cards, but you don't tend to see mono Stark control decks. A lot of like the rest, like if you have to play the Stark loyal cards, that tends to push you more in a mid-range, more in a rush direction. But if you're just playing the non-loyal ones, those tend to be control. So that's why you tend to see Martell Wolf and Martell or Night's Watch Wolf as being really strong, or Beowulf in the form of the World's deck. So yeah. So there are generally 3 subtypes. So that's control overall. So control, at the end of the day, fundamental, big picture, is about sacrificing short-term tempo, usually plots 1, maybe plots 2, for big long-term tempo gains, and running your opponent out of threats. And through kill, through discard, and through control attachments. So we're going to get to, I think, to really understand control, though, and it's why it has 3 subtypes underneath it there. You kind of need to look at those subtypes and how they play to really understand control. Because control, in many ways, is the most diverse archetype. Like, if you understand what a rush deck does, it doesn't matter what that faction card, as long as it's X crossing, or X as we call it in my test group, crossing. It doesn't matter what the faction card is. You know what it's trying to do. It's trying to get to 15 as fast as possible. If someone plays Free Folk, or they play Miri Mazdur, or they have 2 gold and they've got 7 strength coming at you for a military challenge, you're like, oh, this is an aggro deck. Or they flip a 2-claim fly. You're like, that's an aggro deck. It's trying to get me to 0. Someone flips a Greyjoy house card or a Tyrell house card, and it's not crossing, you tend to be like, oh, this is going to be a mid-range deck. or they just start playing like they have a 4 or 5 character board spread out across a cost curve. 1, 2, 7 cost, 6 cost characters, a couple lower cost characters. They start doing challenges like, oh, it's a mid-range deck. Control is the most diversity in its overall strategies within the archetype. So the first, the most common, and of course my White Book co-host Aaron Glazer's favorite type of deck in the world is attrition. So attrition is trying to wear your opponent out of threats. It is definitely the most at that game plan I laid out earlier about I'm going to sacrifice short-term tempo for a long-term tempo game. And of course, currently the world champion, Leonard, congratulations again, Leonard, played Martel Wolf, a control deck, very well throughout a big field and beating some of the best players in the world to become the world champion. It's very powerful. Attrition decks tend to like locations. They tend to like icon control. They tend to like discard effects. Of course, kill. But these days, like a lot of attrition decks have moved away from things like tiers and prefer like effects like Ramsey, combined with March to the Wall, the most common control plot, because it just whittles your board down and marches. Whittles your board down, marches. Whittles your board down, Ramses, or Ramsey March. Ramsey March, Ramsey March. Like that's the dream Martel Wolf thing. I don't have to super go into this because you can just go into the VODs from the World Championship. You can look at Leonard's deck and see how it works. So generally speaking, though, control decks want to sort of play locations early, particularly control locations like Starfall, like Dorn, and then use them to gain card advantage. Dorn's the best example of this, and then begin slowly flipping the board through the form of Ward, through Ramsey, through icon removal. Now, some control decks run a win condition. They tend to run maybe 1 or 2 characters with the renown keyword, like a what's his name? My God, Quentin. Excuse me, Quentin. Or maybe the 4-cost armies out of Martel that have renown over the course of a long game. Or if they're being really cheeky, they can be a Doran's game deck and try to win that way. But a lot of control these days doesn't run a win condition. It just is its win condition is you can't do anything productive, and over the course of 3 or 4 or 5 turns, I'm just going to get unopposed, unopposed, claim, unopposed, unopposed, claim, and win. Just through doing challenges with my crappy characters. That's actually in many ways what separates it from its cousin Stall. Stall has a clear long-term win condition that it wants to get to, and then will win the game. So it wants to control the board, control the tempo, so that it can extend the game and be able to execute that win condition. Attrition tends to not. Attrition, again, just tends to be like, okay, we're on plot 14. You literally have no more characters to play because they're either dead or all 3 copies are in the discard pile, and I'm just going to win 3 unopposed challenges now, 3 unopposed challenges now, 3 unopposed challenges now, and the game's over. There's a lot of incremental value in attrition. It's a value game, again, sacrificing that short-term tempo for long-term tempo gains. Now, Stall, and this is probably going to be the most controversial and where I disagree with and Aaron and I got really kibitzy about in the White Book episode about archetypes that we did. And one of the reasons why I'm doing this video is I get to say my opinion unfettered by being yelled at by Aaron, is Stall. So Stall is another form of control. It tends to love control attachments in the form of course, what I consistently say over and over again is the best control card in the game, which is Craven. Because Craven is such a massive tempo hit for your opponent, where you paid 1 gold, and they paid 7 for Tywin, they paid 7 for Asha, they paid 7 for Victarion, and they can't do challenges against you. And that's such a massive tempo loss. They can defend, but if your deck has a win condition that's not based on winning challenges, and almost all Stall decks are not based on winning challenges, you are going to win the game. And you paid 1 gold for that. Marriage Pact is another example. Milk of the Poppy, the icon removing attachments, these kind of things. It's all about getting these sweet tempo exchanges, particularly in the attachment ways, in the form of Craven, in the form of Milk, in the form of the icon strippers to get rid of them, to sort of get rid of threats, and to exchange to stretch the game out. And of course, to the point in which you can execute your win condition. So the two most common forms of stall are and you can break them in. Chambered chair, so that's Iron Throne plus Chamber of the Painted Table. Most famously, Alex Black won Gen Con last year with Martel Stag, which used that. It just stalled the board, started the balls, it in many ways had an attrition strategy. It tried to wear you out of threats until it could get to the point where it executed its game plan, and then it would get game power very, very fast. And then it used, of course, Vanguard Lancer combined with Orphan of the Greenblood to just constantly take the power off your house. So even if you gained a bunch of power, we could reset the game that way. Or, the other hand, the wall package, Builders being the most famous example of that. Or, in many ways, Stark Watch is another example of this. Again, it uses control attachments, disruption, to prevent you from doing your game plan, so I can execute my long-term one. These decks weirdly tend to be a little bit more proactive in that sense. They're doing things earlier on to sort of muck with your tempo. So probably the best example of this right now, of course, in the current meta is Builders. Builders, despite what many control players who hate Builders want to say, Builders is a control deck. It can do challenges, but so can Martel Wolf. It plays disruption in the form of Craven, in the form of other, and then stalls the board until it can get its wall 2 to 3 power a turn and win the game. And of course, Martel Stag, which is a little bit less popular these days, is also the other classic example. But there's, of course, attrition. And then, of course, interestingly, these two match up poorly against each other. Like, Builders tends to be poor against attrition. And, I mean, attrition tends to be the best in the control mirror, particularly against this sort of third form of control decks, which is aggro control. Now, aggro control is the most interesting. It's the most hybrid-y of these, which is... The best example would be HRD Marine. So the form of this is you have both, excuse me, I might sneeze. Excuse me. You have the best of both worlds, I guess you could say, with aggro control. On one hand, you have a bunch of cool control tools. And this is where Burn is really interesting. Burn is both a control tool and an aggro tool, because it lets you control the challenges, prevent your opponent from doing what they want to do. Also has the advantage of removing that character and killing them, so it can get them to 0. And the nice thing about these target decks is they can switch back and forth, right? Where oftentimes what they'll do is early on, they will burn, and then switch and control your challenges phase, and then switch into its win condition. So it's sort of a little bit closer to stall, but rather than stall, it doesn't really kill things. It tends to just sort of like flatten the board out, just make you're making big tempo plays, but those tempo plays don't matter, kind of thing. Your opponent is trying to leverage these kill tools in the forms of Dracarys, in the forms of Dragon's No Slave, combined with the new Dany, combined with Consuming Flames, to just sort of like hit you, but not really be able to get you to 0 natively. That's sort of what separates aggro control. Is it tends to be able to switch back and forth. It says, okay, I'm going to try to get you to 0. That doesn't work. Okay, I can play a more controlling game where I have this sort of long-term attrition plan where I am short-term, you have a much better board presence than me, but I'm using my card advantage tools in the form of Marine to sort of just constantly be seeing all these cards that I'll be able to eventually attrition you down. So it can flip back and forth between these two game plans, which is what got HRD Marine to the final table at Worlds this year and maintains it's consistently powerful is its ability to sort of switch between the two modes. Say, okay, I'm gonna get you to zero deck. I have a bunch of cool. I have a set up Khal Drogo and a dragon and some economy. Well, let's go to town. Burn in general tends to be that. Of course, HRD Marine can't set that up, but HRD Marine is an aggro control deck. I mean, because HRD Marine has to sacrifice on its setup a lot of its tempo because it can only set up 4 gold, it just tends to sort of play that control game early and then turn into an aggro deck that's getting you to 0. So that's sort of the most hybrid-y. It doesn't fit super well into the archetypes here, but I wanted to talk about that strategy under control. Just to sort of make sure that I cover as many bases as possible. So, control. What does it tend to beat? It tends to beat rush. Well, it tends to beat aggro. Would be better to say. It doesn't tend to beat rush. See, rush is the main predator in many ways of control, particularly since the addition of Jakob Holtmann's plot, which tends to also give mid-range its advantages. It tends to be locked out. Like Martell can't really interact. Night's Watch, Wolf can't really interact with Jakob's plot, King in the North. So if you're able to gain some kind of board advantage and then lock it down with King in the North, you generally would beat a control deck. If you do something like big money plot, get a bunch of power, King in the North, unless you don't have any if you have dupes, you're generally safe. You're generally going to be able to close the game. Control and of course control generally sacrificing the short-term tempo for long-term tempo. So sacrificing turn 1, turn 2's tempo to gain massive tempo advantage turn 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, blah blah blah. The rush decks say, you can't do that. But control decks tend to beat aggro because they don't really like, okay, you killed my green blood trader and you killed my bastard daughter. Okay, cool. You lost a card in that exchange. I got a bunch of card advantage. I got 3 Dorn triggers. Yeah, sure, I'm in pretty good spot here. And then because aggro doesn't have any speed behind it, it tends to beat it. Control tends to punish things that don't have a huge amount of speed. Now, this brings us to sort of mid-range. Now, mid-range and control interact really interestingly. Sometimes control is really powerful against mid-range strategies, but sometimes it's not. So, for example, like Martell Wolf tends to be very poor against Greyjoy. Now, this is a hotly contested thing. We talked about it in the most recent Second Son, so you can check that out and sort of see where it is. But at the same time, because Greyjoy has these like location disruption things and it has a few things that answer against control. But like, for example, like Tyrell mid-range decks tend to do poor against control because again, control by mid-range by having to win in challenges, control gives control opportunities to do things like if you don't have a win condition outside of challenges. And you're not fast, so again, you're aggro or mid-range control with icon stripping, resets, marches, Ramses, all these attrition effects, or just the ability to make such huge tempo swings of, I paid 7 gold for Renly, I put a Craven on Renly, like that's such a huge tempo exchange. Like control prevents mid-range from being able to keep its tempo the way it wants. So mid-range, now again, this tends to be the 55 favored for control, 45 favored for mid-range, because mid-range has enough tools that it can punish a control deck that stumbles. So control tends to be pretty good against aggro, solid against mid-range, and not great against rush. But that brings us to our last archetype, which is of course combo. Combo is, of course, the most controversial archetype in the game. It's what got Aaron and I in a screaming match when we did the White Book episode about this, because he believes, for example, Builders is a combo deck. I tend to not believe that, but you can listen to the episode, you can listen to Aaron's arguments, you can listen to what I'm saying here. And of course, because of OTK combo, which is one turn kill. Obviously, you don't kill your opponent in Game of Thrones like you do in Magic or Yu-Gi-Oh or Hearthstone. But the ability to go from I have 0 power on turn 2 to I have 15 power on turn 2 with no interaction from you is not a very pleasant experience for most players. Same with passive power in the form of Drowned God. People tend not to like that. So what separates a combo deck from control? So why am I separating, for example, the Wall, which is a passive power deck, from Drowned God? It's because these decks are not about interaction. They are about a linear set of interactions that will make them go from 0 to 15 without interacting with their opponent, or interacting with their opponent as little as possible. So that's also what really separates them from Rush. Like, Rush requires interaction. You may not feel that way sometimes when your opponent gets 4 Fast Eddie challenges or superior claims into Winter is Comings, or gets 90 it feels like 90 triggers off Cersei. But there's actual interaction. They have to do challenges to win. Cersei's got to do her 2 intrigue challenges, and then there's the power challenge coming at you. Put some renown on characters. Renown of course, if you're winning through renown, it requires challenges. So if you can find a way to stop their challenges, if you can find a way to disrupt their challenges, they will win. No, combo asks for a level of interaction that doesn't come naturally to Thrones, because it's the furthest away from the on the tin, right? So mid-range, do 3 challenges, defend 3 challenges, just like Nate French, Eric Lang designed it, intended it. Aggro, get them to 0 so they can't do 3 challenges, and you're going to be doing 3 challenges. Rush, it's got to win usually 3 challenges or 2 challenges with a bunch of renown. Still challenges. Control, now we're stepping a little bit further away. It's not necessarily about winning challenges, at least in the short term. Maybe in the long term, it's going to just run you out of threats, push and punish you for having to overextend, and reset you. But it's still about preventing you from doing challenges. You know, either through stealing your characters from Ward, taking your icons away, or putting cravens on your characters. Combo doesn't care about any of that stuff. Yeah, it will like Drowned God will defend a few challenges. Drowned God will maybe do a couple power challenges to get characters out of the dead pile or what have you. But at the end of the day, it's about a linear set of solitary interactions. The most degenerate form of that, of course, is OTK. Again, going from 0 to 15 in a single turn. This has largely been banned. You can look at the very first episode of the how and the why of it to understand how O2K decks work. They're largely banned. In fact, Stalock just banned one that existed in Melee. The current combo deck that exists right now is passive power in the form of Drowned God. Drowned God, also what separates it from Rush and OTK is, of course, Drowned God, generally speaking, can't get to 15 in one turn. It usually needs about 2 to 3 turns to get its combo to sort of get to 15, depending. Because it can get like, well, anyway. But its sets of interactions are very linear. The only form of disruption it runs is Vince's, but it really runs Vince's because, which is, of course, Drowned God's Apostle. No, wait. What is it? Drowned God Fanatic, excuse me. Drowned God. It does run Drowned God's Apostle. The Drowned God cards are so interchangeable in their names. So that's why it's good to call it Vince, right? It cancels your opponent's character's effects, which are great, but it also has the ability to jump out of the dead pile and get you power. That's really why it's running Vince. It just wants to pull characters out of its get characters in its dead pile, pull them out, gain power because it's pulling them out. And just do a bunch of different interactions dealing with it, and win dominance, of course. So it assembles these pieces, and it assembles them very quickly, and then it just executes them. And it will try to stop your opponent from doing that, from doing things, but to doing things to you. It's not really stopping your opponent from doing anything. It's just simply trying to preserve that set of interactions. And if you don't have disruption for that set of interactions, you just lose, unless you're fast. So that's how Drowned God works. It's the most common combo deck in the meta. The combo decks will, as long as passive power abilities exist, for example, like Mace is, of course, probably the most powerful passive power outside of, again, an OTK, Ladies, or Viper situation. passive power card in the game. You can gain something like 4 to 5 power a turn with him. Which Drowned God can sometimes go a little faster than that, but Mace is just like, and Mace gives you lots of ways to protect himself and do tricks that allow you to find your pieces you need to do that, to get to your 15 power with Mace, because he synergizes with so much of what of Tyrell's card draw and things like that. So, but Mace is banned. Well, not banned, but Mace Hightower, that combo deck that we played at Gen Con, the Long Lances played at Gen Con, that's largely banned now. Very difficult to get Mace off. We'll see if Assault of Shadows brings him back. But currently, only Drowned God is there. But as long as passive power exists, as long as there's ways to gain power outside of the challenges phase, you're going to see passive power decks. You're going to see combo decks exist. And how does combo shape up against other archetypes? All right, so Rush is the predator of combo. It's why Drowned God's not very good right now. You Drowned God, if it runs into other decks, generally has good matchups or solid matchups or can win, but it just simply cannot beat Lannister Crossing in any way consistently. It can't beat Stark Crossing in any way consistently. It can't beat Greyjoy Crossing in any way consistently. Other decks, other archetypes, it tends to do really well against. Aggro can be a problem for combo decks, but it's really not. If you can disrupt what they're trying to do, maybe through 2-claim intrigue challenges, like doing like a military challenge, and then it double claim, like a free folk deck does its military challenge, gets 2-claim, triggers an intrigue challenge, and then gets an intrigue challenge, so you're losing 4 cards. Maybe that's a form of interaction that can get it. But again, aggro, getting them to 0 is not really a big deal, because again, it's passive power. It just needs its engine. It just basically needs a turn or 2 of its engine mostly working. Control, it generally passive power beats control. If control is running forms of interaction like Frozen Solid, that tends to be good against it. But of course, control was god-awful against OTK combo because it just really didn't have enough forms of interaction. It tends to be a little bit better against the passive power Drowned God strategies because it runs Frozen Solid. And Ward, of course, tends to be a pretty good form of interaction against it. But still, it punishes, because control can generally gives it the time it needs to see its pieces and assemble this unbeatable combination of cards. Control tends to do poorly against it. Like Builders tends to do really poorly against Builders. Stall tends to do pretty poorly against Builders. It can't keep up with the dominance not Builders, excuse me, against Drowned God, as it can't really line up. Attrition generally has the best shot at it, but it's still nowhere guaranteed. It's like a 55-45, depending on the pilot kind of situation. Tempo decks, mid-range decks. This is where it's interesting. The current flavor of popular ones, Greyjoy, has a good shot because it has a form of interaction. But a lot of mid-range decks, because they care about their forms of interaction, about the challenges phase, about challenges, they can't do anything. This is why, like, Chamber and Chair was good against, this is why Combo was good against, excuse me, not Chamber Chair. This is why Combo was good against mid-range decks, because, like, Lanny Dragon, Lannister Rose, Greyjoy Big Guys, is because their forms of interaction just didn't do anything against them. And down to today, Drowned God has good matchups against a lot of mid-range decks. Greyjoy, though, right now runs forms of interaction against locations, so that can help them. But overall, again, it's not necessarily positive because passive power decks don't care about the challenges phase. There's not a lot that mid-range decks can do because they don't care. They don't give, as I said earlier, 2 shits and a fuck about your tempo. They care about assembling their pieces. It's demanding. The thing that separates combo, I guess, from the other 4 archetypes is it's demanding forms of interaction that, unless you've come prepared to beat it, generally doesn't exist in the other archetypes. So when combo is on the rise. Right now, combo isn't really. There's one Drowned God deck in all of Worlds, and it went 3-3. It ran into some Rush. It ran into Frozen Solids, and just generally wasn't able to quite find that fourth win. A feeling I'm all too familiar with at Worlds from last year. But that was the only one, though, because people understood that the prevalence of Rush really just messes with the ability of Drowned God decks to win. But if combo is present in the meta, because the meta slows down, Rush gets pushed out by a predominance of aggro, Greyjoy, midrange, then maybe combo comes back in. And then it begins beating up on a lot of the mid-range decks, a lot of the control decks, a lot of the aggro decks that are there to answer Rush. So we have this kind of like constantly evolving thing. Now, the thing about Thrones is again, I tried to leave the like rock, paper, scissors natures of it to not be as clean as it is in games like, say, Magic or Hearthstone, because it seems to me at the very least that Danny and Nate don't design with these archetypes in mind, per se, besides maybe Control, besides maybe Rush, but they don't really design with, like, explicitly, like, all right, combo needs to be in the meta to answer this, aggro needs to be meta to answer this, the way in which Magic and Hearthstone designers seem to design. So I don't want to get into the rock, paper, scissors argument, plus it just tends to be a bit too much lost in the weeds. So anyway, I hope you all found this video enlightening, useful. I hope, particularly if you're a beginning or intermediate player, that this video helped you get a better understanding of sort of how decks work, how they balance within one another, and how sort of deck archetypes in general work in Thrones, and what sort of, if you're a Magic player, a Hearthstone player, an Artifact player, I guess that's going to be a thing by the time people are watching this video, I don't know, you have a better sense of how these things work in our game here at Game of Thrones. So this has been the first Hal and the Wire video in a while. I hope to start doing them a bit more regularly now that the big tournaments for me for the year are largely over. And of course, this is also the first How to Wire video on the White Book channel. I am going to be moving all future episodes of the How and the Wire to the White Book channel to sort of consolidate a lot of what us content producers in the White Book are doing, instead of a largely dead channel that John and Aaron set up at the beginning of the game. So while I probably won't migrate the archive of How and the Wire videos to the White Book channel, at least in the short term, I will be putting all future ones here on the White Book channel. So I hope you tune in again in the future. I have some plans for some more deck tech, how to beat them videos, along with sort of looks at reading a meta and things like that. So there should be some content coming up over the winter for you from me in the form of these videos. So if you enjoyed this video, or you didn't enjoy this video, or you want to kibitz about me about how wrong I am about specific archetypes, feel free to do so in the comments below. Otherwise, I will talk to you all soon.